Welcome to the Untangled Faith podcast. I'm so glad that you're here. Um, Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here for sure.
I have been reading your book. I'm so thankful that I don't know if it was a publicist or whoever it was that reached out to me and said, "Hey, Emily has a book. Can she come on
Uh-huh.
your podcast?" I said, "Yes, please. I would love to talk to her." I am one of the people that stumbled across your Facebook
Oh, yeah.
in 2020.
Oh,
Um, my listeners who you probably know from the voiceover by now that um, Emily had this book page, which became kind of a place for people to like see like what's happening.
yeah.
I'm not
Yeah.
an epidemiologist. Can someone
Help.
explain it? Can someone please tell me what to do,
Yeah.
how to understand
Yeah.
all the things that are happening in the world? And so, and all the things that have happened in the last couple of years, you wrote a book.
Yes.
So, give us like the just a brief overview, like what what brought you to be an author, Emily? How did you get to this
Oh,
point today?
that is so true. And, I do wanna say I'm the friendly neighbor epidemiologist, not neighborhood.
Oh,
There
yes,
are
there's more than one,
there are
right?
2 of us, yes,
Yeah.
and she's lovely,
Mhm.
by the way, but we would get mixed up, so I just thought I'd just in case. And thanks for following from I mean, it still is mind-boggling to me when I get to meet people in real life. I mean, I know that that sounds funny because there's just a lot of people at
Yeah.
this point, but it's just so nice to not only have that, but then for people to say thank you or that they like me
Yes.
instead of getting I mean, there was just an onslaught, I'm sure we'll talk
Yeah.
about that, and
Yeah.
where it was quite the opposite, so I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Where did I get to I mean, the author part, I think I've always wanted to write a book. I mean, I just grew up loving Anna Green Gables and, uh, Jo Marsh with the Little Women. So I think I just wanted to, but, you just kinda shelf that once you hit college and everything.
You have to pay the bills, right?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then this is gonna be like what you see in the movies where they do it when they retire, and
Yeah.
but when the Facebook page kinda blew up, I was just contacted by an agent, and I was just convinced it was spam because there were a lot of people at that time contacting me for some pretty awful
Mhm.
harassment and scary
Yeah.
threats that I just trusted no one.
Yeah.
So I just was convinced she's spam, and thankfully she is not at all. She's just lovely. And she basically asked, "Do you want to put this type, the sentiment, I love your neighbor into a book?"
Mhm.
And I was like, "Yes," because at that time I needed the long form of writing. I had been writing 500 posts nearly daily, once a day, twice a day in the height of the pandemic. So I think I was ready to pull back and take a breather. Um, but that's how the book came to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks for
And
having me.
if you people that are listening,
Yeah.
if you wanna be an author, this is not how it happens normally.
Okay. I don't know.
Although I do have to say, it's not like you had, like, this easy life, this easy
Right.
experience, and all of a sudden you have a book that you can no, like, you were in the thick of some really heavy,
Yeah.
hard things that came from having this platform as well,
Mhm.
and to have something, like, beautiful and sense-making come from it is really lovely, but generally, if somebody wants to write a book, they think through, like, "What's my book? How can I write a book proposal? How can I figure out what it's gonna be about?" And what all the like, to start with somebody saying, "Hey, it looks like you're
Yes.
interested in this, and we want to publish that book." That's nice. That's a little bit of like a, "Okay, we just skipped step
Yeah.
1. Now
Yes.
let's get to the work."
Yeah, I often tell people, go viral. If you're gonna go viral, do it for makeup or
Mm.
shoes. I mean, something as benign, kind of benign. I mean, people will still be weird, but I mean, I just would not recommend the
Yeah.
growth that I saw. I'm
Oh,
grateful for it,
yeah.
but yeah, you're right.
Say more about that because in the
Yeah.
podcasting world, I have a lot of podcast friends, and we recently were talking. A friend of mine asked a group that we're in, like, how'd you feel if all of a sudden you went viral? And and I said,
Oh,
terrified,
yeah.
and like, I want to shut it all down. Tell me what are some of the pitfalls of going viral? What have been some of the costs for you?
Oh, good gracious. So I think you are right on the money of going terrified and uh-oh. I mean, all of that. Maybe I could just, I started the Friendly Neighbor Epidemiology page well at the very beginning of the pandemic. And that was just because I was getting people asking questions that I knew, like real life neighbors and family.
Yeah.
What does flatten the curve mean? Do we need to be worried about Wuhan? Um, what does a lockdown look like? Do I need to buy a billion rolls of toilet paper? And so I just
Yeah, and it
started
was
that.
during a season of, like, 2 weeks where we were all sort of together.
Yes, for sure.
However long that lasted. It wasn't very long, but there
Yes.
was a little bit of, like, "All right, let's do this together."
Oh, absolutely, yeah, and that's why I named it. I named it Friendly just because I just overhelp and over I'm so sorry if I sit by you on a plane. I've just always been friendly and joyful. But then neighbor, because I, as an epidemiologist, knew that something like COVID was gonna be different than other diseases like Ebola. I mean, Ebola is terrible, but generally, when somebody is sick and contagious.
Yeah,
So it's a little bit easier to contain. COVID, it was not that. And I knew what was coming. And that's one of the worst parts about thinking about those early days. So I was really just trying to be friendly and helpful, and then they would share it with their friends. I was talking with my son, he's 12 now, but he said, "Mom, do you remember when you hit 500?" Because I would tell my family at the supper table, guys, there's like 20 comments on here.
yeah,
and and I
20.
answered them all in long form. Yes,
Yeah,
because I just loved that. And he said, "Do you remember when you got to 50?" And then when I hit 100, I mean, I didn't see the growth at the time because I was just trying to keep up with the pandemic and, the politics around it. So to the question of what happens if you go viral?
yeah,
I mean, you are extremely exposed all of the sudden with no prep. And
yeah,
that's the middle part of the book is about that. If you're going to act like your neighbor, or you're going to love your neighbor and act like good global neighbors in the world, there will be a cost to it. And it might not be as dramatic a mine, but there will be a cost. When you go viral for being a good neighbor, a good Samaritan, that it's just going to come with a cost. And had I known what was coming, I would have been more prepared. I am
yeah.
incredibly more prepared now. But
The
just to,
word
yeah,
yeah,
go ahead.
it's funny that viral
Yeah,
happened along with a virus,
sure.
and if you think about it, people don't really want a virus,
No.
right?
No. And my kids, they're both tweens and a teenager, and a lot of their friends have ambitions to be influencers and, YouTubers. And they just know from that's not even negotiable. You can't negotiate that with me at all. That's just a
Yeah,
no, a hard no for us.
yeah,
Um, but they've seen it. I mean, they've seen us and they've lived it of what it means to go viral. And I am just not I would much rather be in the back, or like support people. I don't really mind public speaking, but I certainly don't want to do it every day.
yeah,
So that part was hard too.
yeah. I appreciate you speaking into that because I think
Yeah.
there is sort of a misconception of, like, I could just everything would be better.
Oh goodness, no.
Everything would be so awesome.
Yeah, if you're
Well,
selling
everything will
makeup,
be
maybe.
I would say everything would be more.
Yeah.
Everything just whatever you're experiencing is more.
Yeah.
The good is amplified and the bad is amplified, and
Yeah.
it feels like a heavy thing to me.
It's really, yes,
Yeah,
all consuming it can
yeah,
become.
yeah. Your book, is The Science of the Good Samaritan, and I love that you kind of weave these themes of experiences in your life, through the lens of your love of science
Yeah.
from, like, very young and how it just captured your attention and what that has meant for you and loving your neighbor. And so tell us a little bit about your experience with science and, from
Yeah.
young and, like, some of those stories just made me laugh. Your, science fair
Yeah.
experience, your modeling experience.
Yes.
Oh, like, tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you. What a silly so for those that are listening, if you get the print book, you get to see these pictures, a couple of pictures we scattered throughout, and one of them is my science fair board. But I've just always loved learning and always gravitated towards science and math, um, research. I've just loved that. And my parents were incredible that they didn't push, ambition and you have to be top of the top. I remember from a really young age just wanting to be faithful.
Mm,
And to me, that meant I'm going to work to the glory of God, which can skew unhealthy for sure
yeah, yeah.
with
Mhm.
just hustle. Um, but I've just loved that. So then you fast forward through high school, and I grew up in a tiny town, lovely town, but not a lot of opportunities. And my high school teacher, Mr. Acosta, he introduced DNA. I never heard about it before. And you would have thought he put the Backstreet Boys up there or something, or like NSYNC is there, or like Taylor Swift for you youngins.
Yes.
What in the world? I went up to him after class and just asked him, probably as excited as it sounds, "What is that, and how can I know more?" So he gave me a college genetics textbook, bless it. And you better believe I read that whole thing, but I finished it, I remember, on a band trip to an out of town football game, which I don't that's like double nerdy of band and science.
That's right.
But I think he just saw that, and thankfully he said, "Oh, Emily needs to talk with people that love it just as much as she does." So he connected me with Texas Tech University. As a 15-year-old, I started doing research there in a lab that he knew of, and so I spent 3 years doing that. And so the board you're talking about, when it got to my senior year, the board you can get at Staples or Walmart, the
Those
tri
trifold things, the
Yes.
bane of every parent's existence.
Oh my gosh, well, I think I won this one, so I'm gonna make parents happy. I asked my dad, I said, "Dad, I need, like, triple that size." Um, and he made it with his buddy out of plywood with little pockets in between the hinges so you could get double the amount of data, for both of those hinges, and he carried it was I couldn't carry it, but he would carry it to my science fairs. It was just lovely.
You
So
had
that
so much to say. You had so much to say.
I was so excited
That
about it.
typical trifold was not gonna be enough.
No.
You tell about going to different, like, science fair competitions, which I have to tell you, not being a science person, I did not know this was a thing, Emily.
Oh,
These
you didn't?
competitions. But that you went to one, you had done all this work, and you stood
Yeah.
there, and the judges really didn't even come and talk to you.
Yeah. This was
What did you hear from when somebody came and talked to you?
yeah, this was my junior year. And I was actually, maybe it was my senior. Anyways, one of the final ones that I did, and I was ready to go. I had a big old 3 ring, huge binder with like all of my data for any questions they had, but I probably had it memorized. And I set the board up and I realized, a couple of hours in, no one's coming to talk to you. And this was at regional. These like they should have seen the board. Anybody should have for sure. But then, the project was just so good. And finally, a female judge came up to me, probably out of just compassion, maybe solidarity. And she said, I just need you to know that the judges all got together and, they were all men and her. And they just decided that a 16-year-old girl couldn't do the work that you did. That you look more like a model than a scientist because I'm tall and I have blonde hair. I smile. I'm sure, that's why. But so I lost that one and I was devastated to lose it. So it took a couple of weeks, and my science teacher, Mrs. Dodd, and my parents said, "Hey, there's another type of competition. Why don't you do that?" So my parents lugged the board to those, and I ended up winning that one. But
Well,
yeah,
that's those
I
people
wrote
that leaned in and were like, "Hey, they can't see it. Someone else is gonna be able to see that."
yeah,
Yeah, you didn't look like a scientist at the you didn't
yeah.
look right at the right place, but they helped you bring it somewhere else. I was telling my husband, like I'm like, I was just reading the chapter and I was like, "And they didn't even look at her board, this poor thing,
I had
because
my
they thought she was
notebook
a model." And I
ready to
was like, "But
go.
then," she said later on,
I
"she got
threw the
into
good.
modeling,
I
data
did.
modeling."
Data modeling. Yes, that line is like the only mic drop comeback that I have because I am not a person like that.
It just made me so happy. You're like, "Yeah,
Good.
well, I did a different kind of modeling with
Yes.
data." My
Yes.
son is going into data science, so I think
Lovely.
I can't wait to share with this book with him. He just went to, University of Alabama, Huntsville, which
Uh-huh.
is just full of, like there's, like, more engineers per capita in Huntsville than, like, anywhere in the US, and I
Cool.
don't know there's a lot of, like, military and, like, space stuff happening in Huntsville. People are like, "Huntsville, Alabama?" If you wanna go and talk about science and
That's the
this
place.
it is
If
a
I don't,
place. You
yeah, if
could
I feel
find some of your people there, for sure.
these are my people.
You would find them.
I went and talked at my son's school a couple years ago, like on career day, 3rd grade. And I walk in and another little boy in the room said, "You look like a nerd." And the teacher was so embarrassed. And I just automatically said, "I am. But I use it, I'm a girl scientist and I use it for good for the world." And this little bitty girl in the back said, "You're a girl scientist?" Like she hadn't seen it.
Yeah.
So,
I
it's
love
still
that
around.
you showed her, though, this is
Yeah.
possible.
Right.
This is possible. Your options aren't when I was growing up, I'm Gen X, like, are you gonna
Yeah.
be a secretary?
Sure.
Are you gonna be a nurse?
Yes. Well, and in the faith world, I am a pastor's wife,
So if you don't
and
play the piano, you're
oh, yeah.
gonna
Yeah, for sure, helping
what are you
children's
gonna
ministry.
play? I worked under a gal and I worked in higher ed for a little while, and her
Uh-huh.
husband was a pastor for a short period of time, and if anybody has been in the faith world, they know this thing of when at the time, mostly men, 99.9% men going to, like, candidate for a pastor job, brings the wife, and,
Oh,
like,
for sure.
so, Linda was there with her husband, and, like, the committee was like, "And what are you gonna play on the piano?"
Yes.
And she was like, I don't play."
How about chopsticks? Yeah.
So you weren't showing up playing the piano, is what
No,
you're
I was
saying.
showing up in
Although
a
you could play the piano,
PhD.
but
I can, yes,
yeah.
but that's not a requirement, for sure.
Yeah. I wrote down some notes as I was reading your book, and you said, um again, this is about the Good Samaritan, and you said this question that was asked that was wrong,
Mhm.
um, is, um well, I wrote it down. "We have to recognize that asking, 'Who is my neighbor?' is the wrong one. It's the one about being just good enough. The right one is, 'Am I a neighbor?'" Tell me more
Yeah.
about that. What did you learn as dug into your experience with that?
Oh, man. I so that story, most of the listeners will be really well aware of that story, but I don't know if I'd ever backed up of what preceded the Good Samaritan story. And you have this man who comes up to Jesus and said, "Who is my neighbor?" I'm sure they're having a longer conversation there, but instead of answering him, Jesus like judo, karate him with a story, which is a parable, kind of like what he does anyways. And so he tells the Good Samaritan story about two men who walk by the side of the road, or a man who was on the side of the road. And, they symbolized power and privilege at the time. And then you have the Samaritan who finally stops. And not only does he stop, he bandages wounds, he takes him to the place to recover and pays for all of it. And then Jesus returns to that original person who asked the question and said, "No, who was the neighbor?"
Hmm,
And I think that the heart positions are too different. Because who is my neighbor? I mean, you could say that kind of cocky, or what is good enough to be good enough because I've got my life to live, right?
yeah.
How much
To
is
check the box to say, "I was the good
sure.
neighbor." I
I'm
did
gonna
it.
tithe 10%, I'm gonna give money at Thanksgiving. Is that good enough,
Yeah.
basically? Now, we don't know his voice inflection, but that's what I'm reading into it. And then Jesus said, "Who was the neighbor?" Like, not who is the neighbor, who acted, and the act of neighboring was so holistic, overindulgent than just merely tithing 10% or barely helping. So I think the heart positioning is different. And the whole first part of the book on centering is how do we get our hearts to act more like the Good Samaritan intrinsically, where we just stop. Because he did and the other two didn't. And why? There's
Yeah.
probably a myriad number of reasons, but that something made that man stop. And I think it's because he just was living a life of neighboring instead of it being who is my neighbor. I don't you don't we don't know if those other two were just walking by going, is that him or is it this one? Or do I
Yeah.
have time?
Yeah. I love how you talked about centering.
Yeah.
Another term you use a lot in the book is othering. I have a
Mm.
friend who has a book coming out within the next year or so, I think, called Othered. And so I cannot wait for
Oh,
her to read this and be like, she's talking about a lot of the things that you say. And
yeah.
one thing I think is so interesting is and that you point out is how being a good neighbor really is tied into us being able to lean in to see things and learn things that we didn't realize
Yeah.
because of where we were born and the situation that we are in the world. We just don't know what we don't know.
Yeah.
And so tell me about how you were able to recognize the othering and sort of learn to see beyond the perspective that you have in your own life.
Mhm. I just grew up in the church too, in a charismatic church. And so we were the home where a lot of the missionaries came and stayed while they were on furlough. And I remember at a very, very young age just asking them lots of questions of what they were doing. And, I'd read the books on Hudson Taylor and Amy Carmichael. And I think I knew the world was bigger than my little town. So I just wanted to know everything I could about it. So it just started out with reading, and there's the nerdy part of it too, was just reading people's stories. But then, when you're friends with people who don't worship like you, have a different point of worldview, certainly a different socioeconomic status or background, or any of those factors, it changes you if you listen to it. You can walk by, it's not a natural thing for everybody. But if we stop, that's what I'm trying to get across in that centering part of how do we align our hearts so we just stop more and listen. I think, especially in the white church, evangelical church in America, we're terrible at listening, and because we've always had the mic. And I think for a time, it would just be nice to just listen a little bit to voices who have not been listened to before. And that's reading or YouTube or whatever you want to do it. But for me, it's been friendship, and meeting people and going to their homes and just being really, really curious about the world, because then you can't other an entire group of people when they're your friends walking right beside you.
Yeah.
There's a part of the book where I talk about if you notice your friend is walking beside you without shoes, or you're the one without shoes, if you're friends, you're going to say something about that. If you're not friends, you might just move to a different side of the path. So I think there's deep humility. And we see that too, I think, modeled in Jesus. Because when he centered people, it wasn't who you would expect. It was like children, probably disruptive kids,
Yeah.
because that's what kids do. It was the woman who was bleeding and had spent all of her money. She was medically impoverished. That is what I work on. Our communities who are medically impoverished now, and she's the first one I probably read about. When he talks his first sermon, when who he centers, I think he could have really used that opportunity to talk about power, but instead he talks about the oppressed and the captives, and he just flips the table.
Yeah.
Um, he
Yeah.
doesn't other. Yeah, go ahead.
Uh, uh, there was also this theme in there. Obviously, like, you are a scientist. Like, this is
Mhm.
something that God has given you this, like, great interest in. Okay, there's an ice cream truck driving by.
Oh, lovely.
Mine
Go catch it. Look at that's a great day.
Can I
I
just
don't
go
hear
tell
it.
them, "I'm doing a podcast. Can you just turn off the
Oh, I do now.
beautiful
That's wonderful.
music?" I got the dog in the other room to not be barking,
Uh-huh.
and now this is we're just gonna let it come by. It'll be not as loud in a second. Come
That's
on, it's
the
October
best.
9th. What is happening? Although I do live just south of Nashville, so it's not like it's, like,
Do you
winter weather,
too
but
cold. Yeah, we get those in Texas when I lived there and like Christmas.
yeah. Yeah, it's starting to feel like fall, so that's
Uh-huh.
lovely. Alright, I feel like maybe it's mostly gone. This is my I do some of this editing myself, some of it I send off, so my editor's gonna be like, "What just happened, Amy? What are you doing?" It's like a carnival going in the background. Right.
Good background music.
Yeah, I was talking about how you just have this great love for science, and as you learned more, as you dug into and followed this passion that you had, you started learning about health and like history of how health has worked
Yeah.
and who gets help when it comes to healthcare and who doesn't and like how certain things have been discovered and like who
Mhm.
was who was practiced on. What did you learn about being a good neighbor and just about justice and injustice
Mhm.
in your studies of health?
Yeah, I love that question. What did I learn? I learned we don't know more than what we do. And there's I think during COVID, a lot of people saw that too. Because for the first time, at least here in America, people were seeing systemic racism and structural violence or poverty and health inequities for the first time. It always had been there, but it really was unearthed and then just thrown into our neighborhoods, for better or for worse. And so I think that's a lot of the why the book was birthed, because they were asking what's next. Now that we know, what do we do? So what have I learned? I've learned that centering is about giving money and donating food. All of that is wonderful, and also you will hear that thread, both and
Yes.
also,
The
yeah,
and also. Mhm.
the and also. What does the rest of our life look like? How do we spend the rest of our money? Do we take into account just the privilege that most of us have to even access care? I think one of the powerful stories, well, there's a couple in there that I think have really resonated with the early readers. And one of them was, if you go back to 1884, there were 14 white men from all high income countries that got around a horseshoe table with this huge map of Africa on the back wall. You can Google it. It's called the Great Scramble, just to get a
Mhm.
visual. And by the end of that meeting, well, by the way, no one from Africa was there. The Sultan of Zanzibar asked to come and was denied entry. So, what they were trying to do is basically, who's going to colonize what part of the continent? What country is going to get what? So they sliced and diced the country into, Belgium and the US and Europe and all of these different countries of who is going to go. What that did, though, is it separated 10% of the natural, the normal, the existing ethnic groups at the time into two different countries. And so I talk about my work, which is in Somaliland, which is part of Somalia, that they were colonized by two very different countries. And to this day, that has ramifications throughout the continent of the poorest countries, some of the most the ones that have a lot of the civil unrest and war are the countries that were spliced and diced. And I think that it is really important for Christians to understand that, because then we get rid of the othering or the shaming words. Words like, well, it's just a poor country. Or I've
Mm,
heard in the church, why don't they work harder? It is
mm.
their fault they don't have a job. This is here in the US too, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So much shame. when if you go back, it is not all of their fault. Yeah, I also tell the story of when I had my second child, I had preeclampsia, very severe. All of a sudden, so he came real early, and then I was in the hospital multiple times with, stroke risk because of the high blood pressure. But I had insurance, I had a nest egg so I could pay for it. He had a NICU to go to,
Mm,
and we both lived. I tell the story of a woman in Burundi who is my equivalent, just a mom, trying to do her best, goes into labor early, a month early because of preeclampsia, and has to walk 3, 4, 5 hours pregnant in labor to the
mm,
nearest health facility. If she gets there, they don't have the diagnostic testing that they need for preeclampsia. She probably doesn't have the money to even pay for that. And I chose Burundi because it is one of those countries that you can go back to the Great Scramble table and kind of trace its lineage of what it looks like nowadays. Same with Somaliland. So if that woman dies, it is of no fault of her own.
right.
It is the systems and the structures around her, but not just today, it's years and years and years past. You look at generational wealth here in the US and redlining. There are some neighborhoods here in Durham where I live where if they were redlined, decades ago, their worth right now is thousands, tens of thousands of dollars lower than being in a white neighborhood simply because of a policy that took place decades ago. So I think as Christians, I think being like a good Samaritan and not othering is recognizing there's history,
Yeah,
recognizing there's structural violence that, we likely haven't seen before. But I think when we do, we stop on the side of the road, hopefully.
yeah.
And it helps us love them better.
Yeah, I kept, like, writing things down as I was reading saying, "I didn't know." Like, I got on my Voxer. I was like, "Did you know that the pulse oximeter was, like,
Yes.
calibrated to, like,
White
light
people.
skin, and what does that mean?" Like, the ramifications for that.
Yeah.
Um, do you ever wish you didn't know things? Like, when you know something, you can't unknow it. Like, you have this,
Yeah.
like, moment of, like, "I didn't know it's broken. Now I do know it." Like, lots of things are broken,
Yeah.
and I can't unknow it. Like, do you wish you didn't? Like, and, like, what happens at that point? Like, tell me about that point
Yeah.
of, like, "Oh, shoot.
Yeah.
What now?"
I don't think I do. I just have I have too much empathy.
Yeah.
So I don't
And
think
you're like, "Give
so.
me all the information."
That's right. Yeah, get the data points and let's go do something about
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
um, two, I don't think I react that way. I think I react more of I can't do it all, and neither can one other person. And so, what can I do?
yeah,
I don't know if you've gotten to the back part of the
yeah.
book, which is on courage.
When you're talking about Nehemiah, I wrote
Yes.
down I wrote a whole paragraph quote from you. Yes, talk about that.
Oh, lovely. That was one of my favorites to write. Um, but because it's one of my favorite stories too. But when you get
Yeah,
to the chapter 1 of Nehemiah, at the very end of the chapter, he says, "I'm a cupbearer to the king," which
yeah,
in my Bible I've written, you know, 2003, I'm a new mom.
yeah,
2016, graduated with my PhD. These like identifications of who we are, and then you flip the page, and he goes to build the wall back. And he gathers a lot of people together and stuff, and so they get working. And then you get the like wackadoodles of Sanballat and Tobias who come over, and they try to distract him with there are people talking about you. You need to go defend yourself stuff. I mean,
yeah,
anybody would be like, okay, I'm going to fight. He didn't take the bait though. And so they came with a sneak attack afterwards and said, "How about you just come for coffee and let's just talk about what you're doing?" That is theologians don't yell at me right now, but that's what I heard.
yes, yes,
And the first one, which is more blatant, is a pivot, but the other one is too. It's just at a lower degree, like a 10% instead of a 50, but over time they're going to get to the same spot from where you were. So all that to say, they're both distractions. And what he said was, "I'm doing a great work. I'm not coming down. Oh, you bet that my husband, he will text me that all the time
Yeah,
of you are doing a good work. Don't come down for like the naysayers. But also I wrote the chapter because I have a feeling that people are going to read it just because they are lovely, good people.
yeah,
And you can easily become overwhelmed with, I mean, I do poverty and children's health in very resource poor settings. But then I hear about the climate change, and that affects that group as well. And then I hear about hunger here in North Carolina. And I mean, just add on all these topics, and they all matter, but it anchors me of what is my great work that
yeah,
I'm not coming down for. So that I think that is my reaction to now that you know it might be yours to change. It also might be yours to find a friend who's doing that to link arms with.
yeah.
Yeah, to not be so overwhelmed.
How do you know what your thing is? How do you know
Yeah.
what you're carrying the cup for the king looks like? Or if it's the wall building or like
Yeah.
and what is a distraction? Was there like a hint to like, I don't know, some secret some secret handshake or
Secret
something?
sauce.
Yeah,
I don't I mean, I think time does that for us
yeah,
of yeah, because I when I started my master's in epidemiology, day 1, my favorite professor asked all of us, you know, "What do you wanna do?" And I said something probably like, "I just wanna help everybody."
yeah,
And, you know, how do you do that? I have no idea. So
yeah,
now I've gotten more and more clear on that, but also my natural proclivities and giftings. I feel like time has helped harness that into, okay, this is what I'm doing and what I'm good at.
yeah,
Um, but at the same time, you know, during the pandemic, when I was speaking out against Christian nationalism, when the riot happened, and that was another inflection point where I went viral for the good reasons, but with a lot of ramifications.
yeah,
My husband did very gently say, you know, if you keep speaking into the evangelical space at this pace, you can grow, you know, that into that almost being like a figurehead or a leader in that space, or you can keep kind of talking about the global aspects of this and COVID, vaccine inequalities, and poverty. So don't
mm,
lose the inequity for another good thing that is not yours to fight.
mm,
That chapter opens with you don't have to go to every fight you're invited to.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I nearly weekly, I tell him thank you for that because I would much rather be in this natural point of what I'm doing right now instead of in the whatever world I would have landed in.
yeah. There are a lot of worthy causes in the world,
For
and
sure.
we have limited resources.
Yeah.
And like given our where we are in the world, what our family situation looks like, what all
Yeah.
the things, it really sets those guidelines and boundaries of like what we have.
Yeah.
And what we have to give. So I appreciate that so much because I think there are people that are like, there's so many hard things in the world and they're just exhausted with the whole and overwhelmed with
Yeah.
all of it. And so I love that permission to say, you don't have to fight every battle. You aren't called to do all the things. Although I think it can be really hard for people that are justice minded. They're
Mhm.
like, now that I've seen, I got to do something. But I think it is doing something to encourage somebody that is in the
Yeah.
space. It's like really like I don't need to go get my PhD. I don't need to
Mhm.
study epidemiology to say, here are some people I really trust in that space and that are working with data
Yeah.
and like trying to help you understand it in a way that is hopefully not agenda driven and
Yeah.
by anything more than wanting what is best for the world. Um, that's going to get people to the information they need a whole lot faster than if I tried to do it all myself.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
and I
so
do.
maybe framing it that way is good. Like it's more
Yeah.
helpful for me to point to people whose lane that is than to like jump into every lane back and forth.
Right, and honoring the lanes that we're in or that others are in too, because I do talk about what does it look like to be a neighbor. It doesn't have to be these big extravagant things. You know, if it's just the holy work of neighboring
Mhm.
and that could be our children. You know, that could be just rocking a kid at 2 a.m. that will not sleep, but then raising them up to not others, to
Yeah.
not other others, or
Yeah.
justice people that way. And so it's just not, I think when we take the pressure off to be all or be what we see on social media or something, then we can actually just enter into who we are.
Yeah. Tell me about the cost
Yeah.
of running in your lane
Mhm.
and being faithful in a lane that has required saying things that people don't necessarily wanna hear and make
Yeah.
people uncomfortable. Tell me about that cost.
Yes. You're talking about the middle part of the book, which is the shortest section. Um, it's 2 chapters because it's kinda all I had in me.
Yeah.
I did the audiobook
It could
recording
be
of it.
its own book, I'm sure. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Um, I read it on the audiobook and I realized how it still feels to me so messy and
Mhm. Yeah.
hard, and what to say and not to say. But, it when I went viral the first time was talking about, this is in late 2020 when people were starting to say in the church, "Have faith, not fear,"
Yeah.
which really meant come back to church, sing your guts out, you know, don't wear a mask type stuff. And I was going, what is happening? Because at the beginning, there was so much solidarity at
Yeah.
the church, at my own church. I spoke at mine, on a video call to all the congregants on this is what it's going to look like for us. So I was full throttle in. And then I saw what everybody else did, where especially in the evangelical world. At the time, I was in the heart of Texas too. So that is some context here of like
Mhm.
the belly of it. Um, and I just challenged that faith over fear. I said, I think actually Jesus would wear a mask. He would stay home. And here is why. And a couple of days after that, we got our first threat at the house, written in like black and red marker, left in the mailbox. And I am as suburbia normal as possible.
Mhm.
Um, Incredibly unknown at the time. And so to get that, and it was like you need to be punished type stuff, and there's laced with the mark of the beast. I mean, just all the religion stuff. A couple weeks after that, we would see on the TV that there was a far right group, with the same type of colors on their
Mhm.
signs, and it looked, similar. We'll never know.
Right.
But from then on started a pretty severe receipt of either threats like that, threats against my children. Think pictures of guns sent to us with like weird Holocaust imagery, and you should be taken down as long as with the kids. And it's different when it comes from behind a screen. And I mean, it is
Yeah.
horrible and incredibly scary. It's another thing when it comes to your door. And I was getting things from people I knew in real life, like real neighborhood people, um, and people that I worshiped with. And so it was devastating, that we couldn't let our kids go walk outside alone. We had police security. And a lot of epidemiologists were receiving stuff like this too. So I don't
Yeah.
think mine is abnormal. I do think that the proximity to where it was given, at the house and stuff, was abnormal just
Yeah.
because I was in the belly of it. So it was just terrible. I mean, we left a faith community. I've also felt like I was losing a faith tradition that I had spent 40 years just loving.
Yeah.
This is the point in the podcast where I always tear up. So,
Yeah.
at the prayer rally in Washington, D.C. in November 2020, this was the height of that awful surge. I saw people like Michael W. Smith and Franklin Graham, which I had been speaking out against Franklin for a while, anyways.
Yeah.
Um, but Michael W. Smith, no. And I grew up in the charismatic world, so you see all these Bethel groups, and then the Bible is just held up in the middle of it. And I could not wrap my mind around it, so it just felt like it all crumbled.
Yeah.
And then we lose a faith community. I mean, my husband was a pastor there, on staff, and so it was just incredibly unstable. So it felt like when I was holding on to the rope and it finally broke, the floor wasn't there because then my health just said no more. Like my
Yeah.
body after Easter in 2021, I had done a big push there. I'm talking about vaccines. We moved to North Carolina during that time. And my body just shut down with unrelenting migraines that didn't respond to anything for 15 months.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's just 6 months in bed, and I didn't even take a multivitamin with before that, so I never had anything, and I feel really grateful for that because now I understand chronic disease more, chronic illness, um, and so that was my body's response to it, and so the cost might not be as dramatic as that for people, but for me, it has been life, um, flipped upside down.
Yeah. Why do you think there was such resistance to public health
Yeah,
measures that were more conservative in the conservative world? Like, what if you were to guess, I know you can't,
yeah.
you don't know for sure, you're a data person. Um, why do you think there was such resistance to that in our
I
churches?
Well, I kind of wonder if we do know the answer. I think
Mm,
who we vote for matters.
mm,
Had we had uh, New Zealand or Taiwan's leadership during, like, they had the same pandemic that everybody else did too, yet population wise, they did an incredibly better job at not only infections, but very low numbers of low COVID, very low numbers of death. So I think leadership matters. I think when you hear from the top leader that just have faith, maybe not trust the vaccine, even th- doing some type of sneak attack on it, not coming out fully, but just not taking it seriously. It People listen. I just think who we vote for matters more.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And, and I think I live in the Nashville area, so I wonder too if some of this is this fear that, like, if we don't get back to it, how do we make a living? How do
Oh
we,
yeah.
like, if we don't get back to normal touring and getting the people into these buildings that we just built, we just did a capital campaign for a church, whatever. We don't know another way to do this.
Mhm.
And I did not see I saw that more as a fear reaction, that, like, we need to get back to it, as, like, I wanna say, if we're gonna say faith over fear, like, what if we actually believed that if we were willing to just take a step back and give a little bit more time for us to figure out what's happening with the science,
Yeah.
try to figure out how to get our air ventilated better. Why haven't we put our money into that, Emily? Like, this feels like it's not political, but, like, what if we were to, like, this isn't injecting yourself. Like, what if
Right.
we just made our public buildings, the air filtration, that much better? Because we learned that so many people that were in poverty did not have the opportunity to just stay home, right? We just
Yeah.
learned there was so much disparity. Like, what if we did the thing? They're like, if people need to be in public spaces, what can we do to make these spaces
Yeah.
more healthy? Instead of just saying, nothing to see here.
Right.
We have faith, it's gonna be fine. Like, that it just makes me really sad that, like, there are things we could have done. There are things we
Oh
could have
yeah.
done. But, yeah, I see what you're saying about the leadership and the political
Mhm.
thing, because I think if we say, "Well, I voted for the person, I gotta stick with them," like, what does it say about me?
Yeah.
And when your identity is so tied up into that, it's a really lonely place when you untangle from that,
Oh,
and
for
you don't know if
sure.
anybody else is going to be with you.
Yeah. But also how you talk about it. And because pandemics have not, it's not like it caught us completely off guard. And so
Yeah.
there are tried and true playbooks of air quality and lowering the spread. I mean, with something like Ebola that just happened, it was squashed really quickly because we know what we're doing.
Yeah.
But I think that that from the top and then it just permeated throughout was not trusted enough, and then it was just playing catch up. That
Yeah.
is the hardest part about looking, at least for me, about the past 3 years, is it just could have been so different, had that not had happened.
If you were in charge now of all the things,
Yeah,
what would you encourage our faith communities to do in regard to public health? Especially when they know that people are just don't know who to trust.
yeah,
And like, well, somebody said such and such a thing, and then they said something else, and then like I just don't know. Like I don't even know what to do.
yeah.
If you were the
I think
boss.
yeah, I mean, I think finding trusted voices, because for so long, faith and science have been opposite poles, and the faith people think the science people are only going to talk about life or the Big Bang or whatever, and then the science people think that faith people are going to do the same thing.
Yeah.
So I think finding voices that are just trusted are going to be key. But then also, and I think more churches are doing this. But if churches will recognize that a person is a holistic person, so the woman I talked about in the parable with the bleeding issue, yes, I mean Jesus stopped the entire crowd for her, but also helped her. And she was at the point of poverty at that time. The Good Samaritan did the same thing. He didn't just heal the man, he took care of expenses. So I think if churches can just recognize the holistic personhood of a person and all of it is holy, I think that would help with public health too, because that's what we do.
Yeah.
We define the problems and the solutions that matter and that reflect reality through data.
Yeah. I talked to somebody recently about disability and access in the
Yeah.
church, and she said it was really hard to see that really quick response early on. Like glad that churches were willing to do some things to make all of a sudden like scramble to do like Zoom and other
Mhm.
things, and they're like she said, "We were asking for, like, these sorts of things for years,
Yeah.
and we
Right.
weren't worth that work
Yeah.
until, like, that tipping point happened," and that was a hard thing to hear, but I think, like, how can we do better? Like, there are a lot of accessibility things I think we never had to think about before because we were so protected from it, and if you did not know somebody that had any issues with
Yeah.
accessibility, like, you could easily be like, "Well, it's fine. If they need something, they'll let us know."
Yeah.
And, man, what a
Right.
short-sighted view that is. I'm trying to, like, learn from that.
Yeah.
How can we do better? Like, yeah, nobody loves like this isn't anybody's first thing to be like, I love wearing a mask. No,
Right.
nobody
Sure.
loves this. Like nobody's like, yay, we get to
Yeah.
be on screens. But it does some things were made possible that weren't
Yeah.
before. And maybe we can get better at it. Maybe we can make more things possible in a way that is even less and less invasive and
Mhm.
you know, be willing to be inconvenienced a little. Man, we do
Yeah.
not like being inconvenienced, Emily.
No. It also highlights who is being centered, though, because if we
Yeah,
centered the people that Jesus showed us to,
yeah,
there's a part in the book about we take our shoes off because the ground there is holy.
yeah,
And so I think it stops us in a way where it silences us in the best of ways, but then it also helps us understand the what's next part. And it's just going to take some time. But I do think hopefully churches are getting better at recognizing grounds that are holy
yeah,
versus grounds that might just be lucrative.
yeah. As we wrap this up, I would love to hear you speak to the person that just feels so disoriented and saddened by what they have seen in the evangelical world, especially the white
Yeah.
evangelical American church over the last several years. Maybe they have had some like I'm thinking of a friend of mine who has a immunocompromised child in their family
Yeah.
and did everything they could to protect
Yeah.
this child and did not see the church really care and is trying to figure out where their place is in these, as we're dealing with an ongoing COVID isn't gone away yet. It looks
Mhm.
different. We have different ways to fight it. But like trying to figure out where their place is even in the church. Like, would you speak to them?
Yeah. I I think that I would hold a lot of space to just say, "I'm just sorry." I mean, it's just devastating, and I think it's hard for families like that, or just people who thought loving your neighbor looked different, and their churches are not didn't do it or aren't doing it. What do you do there? And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, for us to live into who we think God has made us, it meant leaving,
Hmm.
um, and it was awful. So I think if there's any encouragement, it's the encouragement of we do live through it. You know, our bodies will hold us. Also, we're worthy enough to maybe find a new community,
Mm,
and that's okay too. What I have been surprised on the other side of finding a new community is that there's a lot of them.
mm.
I Every communion since I have taken at my new church, I've just cried on every time. I keep laughing with my pastor that maybe at some point I'll stop.
Yeah.
But for now, it just means so much to be in a community that just understands that and we can worship and work together. Um, so maybe that's the encouragement is that there are a lot of people out there if you're able to. I know there's a lot of people who can't because of kids and youth group, and that's okay.
Hmm.
But just to find a new community out there. I don't know if you've gotten to the chapter on Olaf. Um,
Yes. Yes.
that was written for the person that you're talking about, and
Yeah.
just that reaction of thinking that you're going to be by yourself because you've lost everything that you've known, and instead you find yourself in a theater with like little kids just singing.
Yeah.
You'll
Yeah.
have to read the chapter for that context, but
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
It almost feels like an impossible dream and a really beautiful promise of like there are other
yes,
tables, there's other theaters out there.
right. And not to
Man.
get so I would have loved to have gotten here quicker,
Mm,
but I couldn't have rushed the process or my body. And it is just really, really hard during those times. So I think maybe too, those are okay.
yeah.
You know, the
Yeah.
timetables that last longer than we want are okay too.
And I appreciate you being willing to say, I'm not going to put a lovely little bow on
Yeah.
this little section of my life that was really, really hard. I
Yeah.
think I learned some things. I hope I'm a better person, but man, if you could avoid it, you would have
Yes.
chosen it.
Here's how not to get there. Don't go viral.
Let's not get there. So I'm so grateful for the time that you have, k- um, invested in just writing the book, coming and sharing with this audience. How can we find your book and how can we find you?
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for having me too. These are tender conversations to have. So I've been fairly selective on, who and how to talk about it. So I just appreciate this. This is great. You can buy the book anywhere books are sold, anywhere you love to buy books, independent, or, they're on the normal Amazon, Barnes and Noble type site. I am at the Friendly Neighbor Epidemiologist on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, mostly Facebook because that's where it blew up. And then
Yeah,
I also do a Substack. If you are social media or you don't do that, you can find me there as well.
that's so great. Well, thank you for swinging by. I cannot wait to finish up the book. I'm about 70% through.
Oh,
I think I've
yay!
got like a chapter or two left, and then I'm gonna go and look through all your end notes.
Oh, love. Thank you. Because there's some funny ones in there too, where
I
I
can't
had to
wait.
drop a joke.
And then, write down all the quotes that I thought were so helpful so thank you so much,
Oh,
Emily. I appreciate
thank
this
you.
conversation.
This was great.
Thanks.
Thank you.